27th day, lower water month, 0 CE, UA, finally home. Leanne unwrapped her arms from the elder lich in front of her, lifting a leg to dismount from the back of the skeletal dragon that had conveyed her over the Katza plains. She rubbed her butt with a frown, though her equipment gave her damage reduction. That property didn't seem to save her rear end and various areas nearby from her bony seat. Still, flying was an exhilarating experience. Not only was it new and exciting, but the broad vistas that it offered also represented a wide world of opportunity. It was far different from riding around in a carriage or wagon where one couldn't see beyond the next hill or ridge. A grand conquest awaited them and she couldn't wait to take the next step. That step was very close now, though they still had a mountain of preparations before them. Nearby, Florine dismounted from another skeletal dragon. She immediately tried to pull down her skirts, which were far shorter than she was used to. The next time they flew somewhere, they would need magic clothing that didn't catch the wind and go everywhere. "How's your butt?" Leanne asked. "My butt?" Florine's hand went to brush off the back of her skirts. "It's fine. It's not sore or anything?" "Not really." "Ah, must be nice." Leanne stretched. "I wish I had a bit more padding like you." "Wait, what are you doing? The claw?" "No." She sent a pleading look to the elder liches nearby. They simply looked back. The Sorceress Kingdom's security was biased to the extreme. Sometime later, Leanne and Florine walked up the slope leading to Wagner County's new capital. They hadn't informed anyone of their impending arrival, which allowed them the opportunity to look around without the host of retainers that usually accompanied nobles as they went from place to place. Their incognito state lasted for all of 3 seconds due to the absurd existence known as Florine Gagné. A militia patrol, composed of 4 human men and 2 death knights, came up to greet her. "Lady Gagné," the patrol sergeant saluted smartly, "welcome. We apologize for not meeting you with an escort. I don't think there was any notice at the office about your visit today. We weren't sure when we would arrive ourselves." Florine's smile encompassed everyone, including the Death Knights. "Thank you for your warm welcome, Sergeant." Much in the same way that people frowned when Ludmilla frowned, the men smiled at Florine's smile. Leanne wasn't sure if she was imagining things, but maybe the Death Knights were smiling too. "Is there any place you'd like for us to take you, my lady?" the sergeant asked, "or arrange for a carriage perhaps?" "We're fine, thank you," Florine answered. "We're just here to see how things have changed before heading west." "Is that so? In that case, have a pleasant stay, my lady." The members of the patrol lowered their heads respectfully before continuing on their way. Leanne eyed them sourly as they left. "I'm here too, you know. I'm plenty cute, too." "Wait, no, I'm the ruler of these lands, grr. Are her boobs worth more than my title?" "Wanna get changed first?" Leanne asked. "You're gonna cause accidents in that thing." "Yes, let's. Do we have anywhere to change?" "We'll just use one of the workshops. I wanted to check those first, anyway." They made their way along a service road running behind a row of newly built workshops. Leanne cocked her ear for the sounds of work within, but the stonework of the dwarves was such that not a peep escaped. After making their way inside the first workshop along the way, they found an empty staff room to change in. Leanne locked the door before plopping her infinite haversacks on a bench in front of a row of lockers. She let out a relieved sigh. Even with her strength-augmenting equipment, having 2 of them was still a hefty burden to be moving around with all day. "All of the barges should be delivered by now, yeah?" "One thing at a time." Florine raised her arms as Leanne undid the laces of her top. "You always want to see everything right away." "Technically, they're the most important thing we got going." The rustle of silken fabrics filled the air as Florine's dress slid off of her shoulders. Leanne eyed the tan lines that the garment left behind. Their Endurelements brooches protected them from the freezing conditions that came with flying around, but it appeared that the enchantment didn't save them from being baked by the sun. Leanne ran a finger down the smooth skin of Florine's back. Her friend jumped. What are you doing?" "Look it." "Eh? My arms too?" Florine turned around, reaching out to pull aside the fabric hanging on Leanne's shoulder. "You're even worse. What do we do?" Leanne didn't particularly care, but others certainly did. Was that why her own subjects ignored her? Having pale, unblemished skin was a sign of status and affluence, one that couldn't easily be faked. Aristocrats and commoners alike associated tanned skin as a sign of common status. 9 out of 10 people worked in vocations that required extensive exposure to the elements. 99% of people had at least moderate exposure. Only nobles and the elite of high society had complexions like Leanne and Florian normally did. During their childhood, watching people react to Ludmilla during the winter functions in Erantle was a constant source of amusement. She was always baked brown from running around outside slaughtering demi-humans all summer or whatever she did, so people would always mistake her for a servant who had no right to be where she was. The other noble girls would watch wide-eyed, waiting for the day that Ludmilla would snap and a row of heads impaled on spikes would appear on the city's battlements. To Florian's relief, and Leanne's disappointment, it never happened. Leanne frowned at her arm, wondering what they would do. His Majesty went to Roble for something, didn't he? Maybe he snagged some trade agreements while he was there. Trade agreements? Ah, you mean that, disintegration cream. Eraser cream. Florian whacked her in the arm. Does Lady Shiltier have any representatives with our delegation there? Even if she did, we shouldn't push for it. Everything west of Erantle is Lady Albedo's turf. It's better to go through Jesnor Volkenheim, or just through Lady Albedo. She's a woman too, you know. Despite being a country commonly known for its religious ways, when noble women thought about the Holy Kingdom of Roble, the first things that came to mind were the beauty products developed by its reigning sovereign, Calcabasares. They had every expectation that the Sorcerer King would succeed in his ventures there, so improved relations between their two countries would inevitably lead to increased trade. Relations with Riastais were still at best rocky even a year after the Battle of Katsa Plains, so any sort of progress in the west could be considered a good thing. After helping Florian into a high-quality, yet unassuming dress fashioned in her usual conservative style, Leanne went to unlock the door. "You're not changing?" Florian asked. "Nope," Leanne answered, "this is fine. I'll just use a parasol or something." They left the room, heading towards the main area of the workshop. To their surprise, they found that the facility had another guest. Lord Demiurge? There was no way his being here was a coincidence. His long, spiked tail waved idly as they walked up to join him. "There is something remarkably satisfying about the unfailing, unyielding machinery that you've developed here," Lord Demiurge said as he watched the craftsman at work. "Your words are too kind, Lord Demiurge." Leanne and Florian lowered themselves into respectful curtsies. "All that we've done is taken advantage of principles inherent to the world and put them to work for us." "Ah, but that is the beauty in it, is it not?" Lord Demiurge turned to face them with a smile, raw power being transformed into precise craftsmanship. Simple machines creating ever more complex ones with unerring accuracy. Many have thought to use the undead as substitutes for menial labor, but you have established an entirely new paradigm. One might even say that you've ignited the flames of a revolution. Leanne beamed at the devil's praise. They had interacted on many occasions and she felt that they were on amicable terms. She also knew him to be a sort of craftsman himself, so his recognition for her work was especially gratifying. We're just getting started. Sooner or later, world domination, right? Indeed. Through geopolitical maneuvering, industrial might and economic ties, they would carry out a conquest more lasting and pervasive than any conducted through military might. Stuffy old traditionalists who valued land, illiquid assets and manpower above all else would be swept aside by those who leveraged their resources to tap into the productivity of the Sorceress Kingdom's expanding sphere of influence. It was the dawn of an age that would be pioneered by merchant princes, or merchant princesses, in their case. "Oh yeah," Leanne said, "before I forget, do you have any agents available for an errand in the Holy Kingdom of Roble, my lord?" Lord Demiurge held a position that was roughly analogous to a Minister of Foreign Affairs, so it stood to reason that he had people out in Roble with the Sorcerer King. "I do, but whether they can be of any use, just to be certain, what is it that you wanted?" In response, Leanne presented both of her arms, one held out wrist up. Lord Demiurge's glasses caught the workshop's lighting as he nodded. "I see. With the work ahead of you, I suppose it is a crucial matter. It just so happens that I have some new staff that should be able to procure what you require." "Great. I really appreciate it. We'll be going head first into a huge mess, so getting dragged down by little things would be infuriating." A huge mess was most likely an understatement. While Clara and Florian did their best to be positive about it, even they understood and steeled themselves for the reality of the task that probably lay ahead of them. After they inspected the workshop, Lord Demiurge joined them for the rest of their tour. All along the industrial section of the town, storage yards were being filled with components crucial for the transformation of the land transportation network. I must say that I am surprised that such a simple concept hasn't been implemented before this, Lord Demiurge said. It has, my lord, Leanne replied, in various ways. Freight wagons are essentially specialized receptacles for different types of cargo mounted onto vehicle frames. Every village usually has a wagon or two. If they need to haul grain, they mount a grain bin. If they have livestock or timber to deliver, they'll remove the grain bin and replace it with the appropriate, module. Then why has this only manifested now? They seem obvious in hindsight, but novel concepts are difficult to come across. They're ideas that sit outside of people's knowledge, and even if someone thinks of something, it has to be feasible enough to pursue, which usually requires breakthroughs in magic, technology or thinking. In our case, everything's come together to make it both possible and necessary. Most notably the undead. If we had that much power at our disposal before, someone else would have done it already. It's possible that it already exists using golems instead of undead. The innovation that would revolutionize transportation in the Sorceress Kingdom and wherever it could be delivered was basically a box. A big box, but a box nonetheless. Boxes were not new, rare or particularly valuable, and everyone knew that stuff could be stuck inside them to more conveniently carry around. What made the new boxes special was that they were large enough to carry a lot. By being so large, they eliminated the most pressing logistical issue facing their ports and warehouses, which was the loading time of cargo. Normally, a freight wagon could take up to an hour to load and secure, depending on the cargo. That hour was an hour of that wagon occupying loading space. Most towns and cities were designed with this reality in mind, allowing for a throughput of freight expected of the region's productivity. Erantle was an exception to this, but in a bad way. It was designed as a fortress city first, and trade was an afterthought despite it sitting on a trade hub. Walls and military installations took up space that would be used for thoroughfares and warehouse districts in conventional cities. Industries were packed between the inner and middle ring of walls alongside everything else. The only saving grace was that the city was small, though it could cram up to 250,000 soldiers within its walls in wartime. Its permanent population was close to 20,000. After the annexation of the duchy, the demographics of the city changed. A small fraction, perhaps 5%, were affluent enough to flee or possessed a degree of talent that would guarantee them jobs in other cities. The city's slums were demolished and roughly 7,000 of its residents were relocated to the devastated areas of the royal domain in the northwest of the duchy. A few thousand more citizens trickled out after that, either due to migration to rural areas or the remainder of those not wanting to see what would happen next under the rule of the undead. This left Erantle's population at roughly 10,000. While this had some dire economic implications, it also meant that there was opportunity for new growth and development. Unfortunately, logistically speaking, much of that development came with the creation of a new demi-human quarter in place of the vacated slums. The influx of demi-human residents made up for some of the population loss, and spares still trickled in from the rural regions, but this remedied none of the issues looming before the city and probably made things worse. The use of undead labor and magic to boost agricultural yields resulted in anywhere from double to triple the usual output of goods. In the most extreme case, Wardensvale went from exporting next to nothing to having so much that they couldn't move everything fast enough. The increase in rural productivity and the resulting flow of goods being transported culminated into what Lady Sholtier called traffic jams in Erantle and the towns in the duchy. Measures to mitigate this were taken, of course. The military ring of the city, which was the majority of Erantle's land area, had portions leveled and transformed into temporary warehouses and larger loading areas for goods. Undead worked tirelessly to load and unload cargo, but that still didn't address the fact that there were inconvenient things called walls around the city, and cargo needed to go through the city's gates. Those gates were fortress gates, which meant that they were small openings in massive gatehouses that only allowed one-way traffic. Thus, they were not only limited to loading times but the amount of traffic that could flow through the city gates. The first measure taken was to restrict cargo that was not processed in the city, such as goods being exchanged by merchants who would then take them elsewhere, or inventories of merchant caravans that were not expected to completely sell, to the new warehouses in the military district. Another measure restricted access to certain types of traffic according to a schedule. Mornings and evenings were allocated to visitor traffic, which consisted of merchants and travelers from abroad. Towns were positioned precisely at the beginning and end points of a regular day's journey, so major delays in the morning and evening were unacceptable. Citizens of the Sorceress Kingdom who wished to travel around the duchy were encouraged to use its public transportation, which were wagons drawn by soletas. For the time being, public transportation was free to encourage its use and people could get from town to town in an hour or so. Freight wagons operated by soletas did most of their moving at night when no one else was using the roads and gates. Still, it wasn't enough. The harvests were especially bad, creating lines of wagons several kilometers long. The redevelopment of Irantal was in its planning stages, but, much like the festival planning committee, they were caught in an endless loop of adding things and perfecting them. Nothing was too good for the Sorcerer King, and the capital of the Sorceress Kingdom had to have the best of everything. While the members of the royal court all agreed on that point, not all of them were rational about the ongoing issues. Once, Lady Shaltir grew so frustrated with traffic problems that she pulled out her weapon and declared that she would just poke holes in the city wall. She was convinced otherwise by Florine, who pointed out that she would be damaging the Sorcerer King's capital. Done was better than perfect, but there were limits. Rather than trying to argue with or otherwise convince the royal court to settle on a plan and carry it out, Leanne and Clara decided to just go ahead with their own projections, expanding the roadways in their territories, which included the royal highways, and building their towns. Kowloon Harbor was already done and thriving as a secondary trade hub for merchants from the theocracy and traders who didn't want to deal with the delays in the city. The next step was to introduce the cargo system that their new towns and roads were designed for. New vehicle frames were produced and mounted with freight platforms that were designed to carry the new boxes. This was essentially the secret of the new system. Cargo was loaded in advance. These preloaded cargo boxes were then loaded onto the new wagons and sent on their way. In the time it took to load a wagon under the old system, they could load 30 old wagons worth of freight with the new. In every aspect, this new system of freight handling would revolutionize cargo transport, and more innovations were already branching out from the core concept. "I'm curious," Lady Wagner, Lord Demiurge said. "Do you have a version of these that can be used in places with inferior infrastructure?" "What are the limitations, my lord?" Leanne asked. "We have a half-height version of the 5-meter one that won't wreck the Empire's roads." "No roads at all," Lord Demiurge replied. "Dirt paths at best." We have vehicle frames that can handle that, but they'll create tracks pretty quick. Once it rains, you'll be screwed." "Does it have to be mounted on a wagon?" "No. The clients in question don't have access to wagons." Leanne looked around the yard, eyeing the various parts and pieces that went into making the new freight system work. "Conceptually, it should be pretty simple as long as you have teams of Death Knights or something of similar strength and endurance." "Do they have that, my lord?" "They do," Lord Demiurge nodded. "How soon can you have that ready by?" "Of the half-height models that you mentioned?" A prototype by the end of the week. Testing will take a few days. After that, it depends on the refinements that you'd like." Simple and rugged should be the key points, rugged enough to survive everyday collisions, being dropped or falling over. "No enchantments." "Enchantments are unnecessary. We'll just order replacements." After a moment's thought, a smile grew on Leanne's face. "I see. In 3 weeks, we can have up to 24 sets ready to ship, my lord. The product will be pretty simple, so I don't foresee any major delays." "Excellent. Let me know when they're ready and I'll send my people to pick them up." "Will do," Leanne replied. "Thanks, by the way." The trace of a smile crossed the devil's lips. "It is a pleasure to be of service, Lady Wagner." Lord Demiurge teleported away after confirming the details. After checking the rest of the workshops, Leanne and Florine headed to the town square for lunch. The place was at least twice as busy as she remembered. It even had a few demi-humans mingling with the residents and visiting merchants. She silently shook her head at the unprecedented progress on display. When one had everything, everything worked. Within the Sorcerer's Kingdom, they had every expectation of succeeding at their ventures. The problem now was achieving success in foreign lands. I'm going to check some things at my company offices here, Florian said. Will you be alright if I leave you alone? Sure, Leanne replied. I'll stick around here. Leanne crumpled up the wrapper of her crepe from death bread. She tossed the refuse into a nearby garbage bin and then eyed the cylindrical container fashioned from sheet metal. Progress, huh? While change did occasionally come in the form of revolutionary innovations, it most often manifested in the little things. Sometimes, the well-to-do would coin the term filthy peasant. This was not because the people themselves were particularly dirty. People tended to dislike being perceived as disgusting, after all, but due to what they did with their refuse. Generally speaking, waste was a landlord's problem. How much of a problem it was depended on the location. Out in the rural regions of a territory where the vast majority of people lived, there was plenty of land and thus plenty of options for waste management. Cesspits for night soil could be dug and dumping grounds for garbage designated. Rural villages also tended to be built with access to water in the form of wells or streams. Village chiefs, who were entrusted with the management of their villages by the local lord, were responsible for making sure things went where they were supposed to go. Ultimately, however, it was the lord's land and thus the lord had to pay for everything that went into managing things like waste. Some of it could be used as fertilizer. Other things had to be burned. Garbage couldn't be left around for too long because it would attract vermin, dangerous scavengers and certain races that thrived in filthy conditions. Urban waste management, however, sucked. This was especially true in small, poor towns that couldn't afford proper city infrastructure. When a lot of people lived in one place, a lot of crap built up. People dumped all of their crap, which sometimes included little crap, someplace where it was no longer their problem. Because towns didn't have the space to create dumping grounds within their premises, this usually meant into the alleys, streets or some other place where people thought they could get away with it. Night soil, food, broken furniture, ruined clothing, scraps of material, ashes and industrial waste, which included manure from horses and other livestock just piled up. Keeping the land clean was a profession in itself and, of course, this was the local lord's problem. If it built up, the people resented the local lord for it. They also resented the local lord if taxes, which were dependent on seasonal productivity, were insufficient to pay for sanitation. If taxes were raised to pay for sanitation, resentment turned into unrest. Notable change regarding waste management arrived with the annexation of Eranthal. Not only did the undead tirelessly perform menial labor, but Lady Albedo hated filth. All of the Sorcerer King's servants hated it as it befouled the Sorcerer King's precious kingdom. The very first thing that Lady Albedo did was order the undead servitors to scour the streets clean. They did so with such violence that the citizens thought that Eranthal was being sacked. Next came beautification ordinances. Local leaders were ordered to bring their villages and towns up to a certain level of cleanliness and keep it that way. Plans for proper public sanitation were laid down and harsh penalties were levied against anyone that dared to dirty the Sorcerer King's realm. At first, the penalty was an eternity of anguish, but the Sorcerer King had it changed to a fine instead. The garbage bins found at regular intervals and other measures for dealing with waste were slowly introduced over the months, but people still weren't used to using them. Gradually, however, the Sorcerer's Kingdom became an alien place where not a single refuse pile could be seen. The transition to undead servitors also meant that much less waste from animals. Twirling her pastel blue parasol, Leanne took in the sights of her new town while waiting for Florian to return from an errand. A group of men gathered in the plaza in front of the post office caught her attention and she wandered over. Oh, Countess Wagner, you're back. Yep. What's going on? Ogling the vampire brides again? The man who had replied to her gestured with his chin. Leanne followed it up to a spot above the post office. Oh, yeah, Leanne murmured, they're here now. I haven't seen them before. Leanne plopped herself down at the end of the long bench where the men were seated. They turned their gazes up towards the overcast skies, watching and waiting. I'm back, Leanne, what's going on? The men's gazes went to Florian. A few of them shifted uncomfortably. We're bird watching, Leanne said. Bird watching? Florian turned her head up to look around at the sky. What kind of birds? Tits. Without a single exception, the men at the bench scattered and fled. A few moments later, the flutter of wings sounded from overhead. A harpy flew in from the north and alighted on the lip of the postal officer's aviary. She settled herself and stretched languidly before reaching into her pack and putting on the shirt of her uniform. Florian turned and leveled a look at Liane. What? I wasn't Ron. Wait, ow. 10 minutes later, they were in a carriage headed west along the highway. Florian sat in the opposite corner of the cabin, frowning out the window. You're being racist, Liane muttered. You can't just force other races to conform to our customs. Well, you can, but it would be against our policies. I'm not being racist, Florian shot back. Your subjects allude. This is your fault. How is it my fault? If a pair of boobs comes flying through the air, people will look. Florian pouted, her sigh misting the window. Outside, scenes of tenants sowing the fields whizzed by. With her promotion to count came more land, but since House Wagner was easing itself out of the market for draft animals and expanding its machining and vehicle industries, its allocation had changed. Copses, or at least future copses, were being cultivated on a fifth of her land, replacing fields of grain. Their primary purpose was to produce charcoal for her growing industries. They also provided wooden components such as panels and furnishing frames for vehicles. Since the duchy already had a robust timber industry, the copses were more of a backup just in case they experienced supply hiccups. Liane suspected that it was an unnecessary measure, but Ludmilla also insisted that she should have at least that much woodland anyway. Another fifth of her land was leased, well, more like lent, out to Florian so she could expand her ranching and poultry operations. Fodder was becoming increasingly cheap in the Sorceress Kingdom, but land was just as limited as before. There was also the matter of the growing populations of carnivorous demi-humans in Eranthal, and the mistress of fertile pastures fretted over whether everyone could be kept well fed. The remaining 60% of her rural territory was being used for experimental crops. A third was cotton, another third was rapeseed, and the final third was a joint venture between Florian and herself that raised sheep. The cotton would feed Liane's ongoing foray into the textile industry. Cottonseed could also be processed for oil. Rapeseed was primarily for oil, and the rest of the plant would be used for fodder. The sheep produced wool, which went to Liane, and meat, which went to Florian. Between their two original territories, they had plenty of spares to help fill out their half-vacated new lands. Still, they were major changes, and the county wouldn't see optimal levels of utilization for another generation or so. Liane propped her feet up on the seat across from her with a stretch and a yawn. With the Solita conveying them at daytime speed limits, it would take a bit over an hour to arrive at their destination. Transit between locales was one of the few opportunities to relax while they were performing their duties. Lord Demiurge is a nice man, Florian murmured. Look, Liane frowned at Florian's statement. I know he didn't have much luck in the Empire, but I don't think it'll work between you two. Lord Demiurge is a great guy, but he's also a devil and all that. She snatched her leg back as Florian rapped a knuckle against her shin. That's not what I meant, Florian said. What he asked just now, he did it to help us, didn't he? I can't see why it has to be just for one reason, Liane rubbed her leg. It will help us out a lot, though. The more I think about where we're going, the more problems I imagine. It's not like you to worry so much. That's because our world isn't falling apart, theirs is. If things weren't going so well for us, you know how I'd be. By the measures of most, Florian would be considered a very good person. Liane, however, was not. Personally, she thought that they balanced each other out quite well, but most people only judged others based on the results and rarely if ever on the process from which those results were derived. This meant that, to most people in the Sorceress Kingdom, Liane was considered a good person like Florian. Those who knew her or at least had some inkling as to what she was really like either pretended that she wasn't or didn't care, because one did not need to be good to get by in life anyway. Only a few embraced and accepted her for what she was. Those who could become friends were even rarer still, and they were the most precious things in the world to Liane Wagner. Florian was a childhood friend who knew her through and through. Due to this, they had a dynamic that combined their views to accomplish all the things that they did together in balanced ways. Liane was scared of Clara at first. The prodigy of House Corlin was such a goodly person that Liane thought that Clara might exorcise her like some sort of demon. Ludmilla simply just was, an immovable mountain who was disconcertingly neutral on matters of good and evil. What she mostly cared about was order, which made them pretty compatible. Where they were going, Every one of their perspectives would be needed to fully accomplish their task. Pastoral scenery rolled by in silence as Leanne mulled over the times to come. When they crossed the line of Gonye Barony, Leanne glanced over at her friend. "We stopping at your place? I thought you wanted to go straight to Corlin Harbor." "Stopping for a bit won't kill me. Let's just keep going," Florine said. "It isn't as if stopping there will do anything." She supposed that was true. Unlike Leanne's lands, Florine's weren't prone to radical change. The advent of the Sorceress Kingdom simply allowed her to do more. Their carriage slowed and shifted as it turned south towards Corlin Harbor. The top of the town's limestone walls gleamed white in the midday sun, and the vermilion flags of the Sorceress Kingdom waved from every parapet. Overlooking the town was Corlin Castle, but their route took them off of the highway before the road rose to cross the Katza River. In the once empty space under the western side of the highway was a new set of dry docks. 4 of them extended nearly 150 meters north from the waterfront, lined by all manner of storage lots, shipbuilding equipment and cranes. They were covered by a massive roof supported by steel girders, and magical devices flooded the interior with light. Death Series servitors were stationed at regular intervals while the workers, who consisted of humans, dwarves, elder liches, vampire brides and dozens of undead laborers, performed their tasks around the site. Resting in each dry dock were 3 barges, each 40 meters long and 8 meters wide. Unlike the wooden ships that might sail the seas of the region, these were constructed from dwarven steel. Each hull plate, wall and metal component was engraved with simple runes that prevented rust and light wear. They disembarked from their carriage, walking up to join Clara, who was waiting for them at the water's edge. "So," Leanne said. "Here we are." "Indeed," Clara replied. "Here we are." They looked at one another awkwardly. It seemed a weak statement to make, but Leanne couldn't come up with anything else. Everything was just so big now that words couldn't convey a fraction of what everything meant. "Did everything arrive in one piece?" she asked. "Yes," Clara said. "Lady Shiltier started bringing them in via gate a week ago. The shipyard staff has inspected each of them a dozen times and they know them inside out by now. We were just waiting for you to arrive before we got started." Clara led them over to a platform that overlooked the first dry dock. Leanne leaned over the railing, gazing down at the vessel below. Though she had seen the prototypes that had led up to the first production model of their cargo barges, seeing the ship ready to begin its service nearly overwhelmed her with giddiness. Much like their new freight containers, the barge was lacking in any sort of novelty or glamorous ornamentation. It was just a larger, metal version of the river barges that one might find elsewhere. Its capabilities and what it enabled them to do, however, were likely unmatched safer in the great nations in the center of the continent far to the southeast. Like any barge, it had a cargo hold that took up the majority of the ship. Unlike other barges, the hold had been adapted to house the new freight containers. It was a rectangular opening in the hull 33 meters long, 6.5 meters wide and 3 meters deep. This was enough space for a dozen of their regular 5-meter-long freight containers. Each of those freight containers had a capacity of 20 tons, so a single fully loaded barge had the same capacity as 60 of House Wagner's old, conventional wagons pulled by draft horses. Ships could always carry a lot. These ships could carry more than a lot. Furthermore, their barges were not reliant on wind or current. "Are you ready, Leanne?" Me?" Leanne's lip twitched. "You were the one that insisted that we wait for you before launching these for testing," Clara said. Leanne straightened and stepped back from the railing. She exchanged looks with Florine and Clara. "Let's do this," Leanne nodded. "I can't wait to ride around in this thing." Clara smirked, then looked down at one of the workers and nodded. Shouts sounded out as the roar of water filled the air. The barge floated off of its mounting blocks as its section of dry dock was filled. "Ooh, it didn't sink," Leanne said. "It has already undergone trials in the north," Clara frowned. "Why would it sink?" "Something I'm not used to, I guess," Leanne replied. "Metal doesn't usually float." The shipyard staff swarmed around the sides of the ship. Several boarded to inspect the hold and crew compartments in the stern. Leanne turned and headed down the stairs of the platform, unable to keep the childish grin off of her face. "Come on," she said, "let's go." "Naoam." "We're not nimming yet." "Naoam." "Leanne." Florine raised a hand threateningly with a scowl. Leanne fell silent. She pursed her lips, fiddling with a lever on the bridge of the barge as the shipyard staff checked the hull for leaks. Florine eyed the lever as Leanne shifted it around. "If that thing breaks," Florine said, "you're going to be the one that cries the most." "It's not gonna break," Leanne replied. "If it could break from this much, it'd definitely break when the whole thing's running." Leanne recentered the lever before stepping back from the front of the bridge. The Death Knight helmsman took her place. Behind them, the Elder Lich captain was looking down at one of several binders spread across its desk. At least one of them was a manual, another was the ship's logbook, and one was probably the notebook that every Elder Lich carried around. The others. The Elder Lich looked up as she walked up to its desk. "All raring to go, huh?" She eyed the binders between them. Somehow, the ship's log was already a third full, but that was probably because so much testing was being done. The operations manual was open to the helm controls. The first of the unknown binders was open to a map of the harbor area. Another appeared to be a manifest. "Hey," Leanne pointed to the last, unknown binder, "what's this one for?" "Incident reports," the Elder Lich replied. "Why are you already 2 pages in?" "Because there have been 2 pages worth of incidents." She flipped the binder towards herself, frowning at the lines recorded within. "You don't have to note every time someone clunks into the ship with something, you know. Everything's rune-crafted." The Elder Lich wordlessly flipped the binder back. Leanne sighed, walking over to watch the workers move about over the ship's deck. According to Ludmilla, who had learned a thing or two about items from the Sorcerer King, every material had a certain hardness that acted like the damage reduction provided by the belts Leanne, Florine and Clara had. Any attacks directed upon an item had to surpass that hardness to cause damage to it. The physical condition of any single component was known as durability. There was a vague awareness of this as presented by their common sense. Whacking a wagon axle didn't do anything to it until one applied sufficient force, which was contingent on what tool was being used, the quality of that tool and the material it was made from. Items made from glass were easier to break than wood, and wood was easier to damage than steel, and so on. Items became stronger after enchantment, and those magic items could inexplicably repair themselves even when suffering physical damage that broke components or made holes or tears in them. Master artisans could demonstrably produce superior goods compared to apprentices using the same materials. The last part had something to do about the job class thing that Ludmilla and Clara had become more than a bit obsessed with over the past few months. Ludmilla had learned about it first from the Sorcerer King and his servants, then shared the information with them once they became Lady Shultier's vassals. They were also sworn to secrecy about it, as the knowledge was supposed to be invaluable, addressing many mysteries of the world and reshaping what they knew. Many things were mistaken as mundane or at least normal, and they were slowly qualifying and quantifying all manner of abilities, skills and bonuses in every field. One application of their new and revised knowledge was in how each component of their barges was constructed. Generally speaking, construction projects had set budgets, and a manager would figure out the most cost-effective way of getting things done. Their way, however, might be said to be the most expensive way. Leanne imagined that more than a few would look at the costs and decide that it was a noble stereotypical extravagance. Instead of hiring a spread of artisans ranging from apprentices to grandmasters depending on the parts ordered, they hired the most experienced and talented artisans possible for every little piece. They of course had to make it worth the time of these artisans, so their budget inflated at an alarming rate. The immediate upside was that rune crafting didn't have the material costs of conventional enchantment. In the end, they had extraordinarily cheap enchanted ships, relatively speaking. Major accidents could not sink their barges. If something tore a hole in the hull, it would repair itself as soon as the offending obstacle was clear. Losses to durability could be repaired in port by mages with advanced mending spells that did not incur permanent durability loss. The only true threat to their ships, that they knew of, at least, were enemies that employed sundering attacks. Sigurd, using sundering attacks with his frost reaver, could dismantle the hulls with relative ease. Not that they expected frost giants to come after their ships everywhere they went, but they probably weren't the only ones out there that could present a danger to their cargo fleet. Once she had her fill of the bridge, Leanne went down the flight of stairs leading to the space below. 2 pairs of crimson eyes followed her as she descended into a dark room roughly the same size as the one above. "Any problems down here?" Lian asked. All comfy? The two death warriors shrugged. Lian walked into the space between them. She couldn't imagine that a living being would find their job comfortable for long. Their seats faced forward, positioning them so they supported themselves by gripping a steel bar in front of them. At their feet were pedals, but unlike pedals one would see in a forge or workshop, these turned a set of gears that transferred power to the vessel's drive shafts. Like the solenoid-powered drive shafts in her workshops, these turned something, and that something was a pair of fan-like contraptions in the cylinders rising beneath them. Clara, inspired by her magic fan/cooling box combo, asked Lian whether the same principle could be applied to water. The end result of months of design and testing would now propel the barges. The fans in the cylinders would draw water from intakes at the bottom of the hull and expel it out of nozzles in the rear. At first, their small, proof-of-concept vessels constructed in the autumn used tillers to steer the ship. After some fiddling around, they switched to nozzles that could direct the flow of water forced out of the cylinders, which allowed for superior handling. Some more fiddling around resulted in deflectors being added that could be dropped in front of the nozzles, allowing for reverse propulsion. Grates were added to the intakes to prevent debris from entering the cylinders, and an access port was added to each one just in case the fans got gunked up. The test results from the north showed no sign of problems, but they hadn't operated the ships at full load. The best they could do was pile them full of boulders and tree trunks so her frost giants sit in the hold. Lian, Florine came halfway down the stairs, they're ready to start moving. She came up to join Clara and Florine on the bridge. Out on the deck, workers were standing along the edges of the hold, looking down at the water. Lian looked towards the stern, but the wall of the bridge was blocking the view. How do they know where they're going? She asked. The Elder Leech's imp familiar is outside, Florine answered. It can fly to any part of the ship to check the surroundings. I'm gonna go look outside, but let's get started first. Behind them, the Elder Lich captain's dry voice rolled out, issuing orders to the Death Knight helmsman. Set both nozzles to reverse, it said. Gear 1, 1/4 speed. The Death Knight manipulated the levers that lowered the deflectors and then adjusted a set of dials with twins displayed below decks. Each Death Warrior would shift gears and pedal according to what was shown. The murmur of the workers on the deck and spectators around the dock was the only sound that could be heard as the barge glided silently into the harbor. I kinda expected something more impressive sounding, Lian frowned. Why would it sound like anything? Clara said, when it's going faster there will be the sound of the waves that it makes, but there's not much to make sound within the ship itself. Oh, these things don't have bells, do they? You're right, Clara replied. When things get busier, we'll need some sort of warning system. These barges might be tough enough to crash through the E-rental wall, but colliding with one another is a different story. They walked out of the bridge, circling around it to look out over the stern of the vessel. Swirls of water flowed out from below as the barge continued making its way out from its berth, but Lian's eye was drawn to something else. Say, aren't we really, high? Like maybe 10 centimeters of this thing is in the water. When we start nimming we might go flying off somewhere. It's not as if we'll capsize maneuvering around in the harbor, Clara replied. Once we take on cargo we'll displace more water. Once the ship was fully out of the dock, it started pivoting in the water to align itself with the harbor front. The barge then made its way to a cargo berth where sets of 5-meter containers awaited loading. A gantry crane moved to pick up one of the containers once they stopped. The harbor's gantry cranes were scaled-up versions of the gantry cranes used to load trees and other heavy loads onto freight wagons. Each was made entirely from steel and operated by teams of death warriors. The cables cost 10 times more than the frame itself, runes did not work with them, so they had to be conventionally enchanted. Still, they would never rust, had the added resilience from the enchantment and could be repaired via magic. When the crane's lifting frame settled on top of the container, an imp flew up to lock the pins on the frame to the corners of its load. The pins on the bottom of the container were unlocked from its bed and the crane slowly lifted the container from the ground. Your staff must have practiced a lot, Florine said. All day and all night since the containers started arriving from Lian's place, Clara replied. Each step in loading and unloading is broken down into simple steps, so the undead can perform them without issues. What goes inside is a bit more complex, however. What do you mean? Lian asked. When normal wagons are loaded, Clara answered, people just try to figure out how to fit as much as possible into the available space, and the center of mass is such that it won't tip over unless the load is outsized. With these containers, we fit in as much as possible, but we need to make sure that things are balanced within acceptable ranges so stress to the container and whatever it's sitting on doesn't cause damage. Each container could weigh up to 20,000 kilograms when fully loaded, so what Clara mentioned made sense. The logic that went into each container's cargo was more akin to warehouse rules than wagon ones. The heavy, tough stuff was spread out across the bottom. Big things were never stacked on top of little things. As the container was lowered onto its mount and locked into place, Leanne eyed the waterline of the barge. We barely went down any, she said. We won't sink too much according to the data from the load tests, Clara said. That brings me to something I wanted to talk about. The hold of this barge can house a dozen containers, but it can easily accommodate a dozen more. Leanne eyed the containers stacked up nearby. They locked onto each other the same way that they locked onto their mounts and the lifting frame, so there was little risk of them falling apart. That won't be dangerous? Leanne asked. If the draft is too deep, we'll scrape along the bottom of the river. If the deck is too low, waves can go over it. According to the test data, Clara answered, 24 containers will still leave the deck over 2 meters above the waterline. The ship's draft should be just over a meter at the same time. At Corlin Harbor, the Katsa River is 4 meters deep in the late summer. Even at Warden's Vale, it's over 2 meters deep. We had undead scour the river bottom for protruding hazards and Lord Mayor deepened any potentially problematic stretches. It was admittedly attractive. Each container took a single powerful undead servitor to transport with a wagon. The barge's holds had space for a dozen containers and each ship was operated by 4 powerful undead. The Soul Eaters could only transport half-sized containers on the roads outside of the Sorceress Kingdom, so one could say that the barges were 6 times as efficient as a wagon drawn by a Soul Eater for international freight so long as there was a navigable waterway and suitable port facilities. If they doubled the number of containers each barge transported, it became that much more efficient and profitable. The advantages of ships over horse-drawn wagons had always been known to them and it appeared that many of those advantages still applied to the undead. The river is calm enough to do that, Florian said, but I think we should be careful when transporting things through larger bodies of water. According to the frost giants, waves can be much higher and they become destructive when close to shore. That's fair, Clara nodded. We'll probably need to keep things simple starting out anyway. It's more a consideration for when we're done with the Draconic Kingdom. I wish I had even a tenth of your confidence, Florian sighed. I'm still scared to even open my eyes when we arrive there. It'll be ugly for sure, Leanne said, but the only way we can fail is if Queen Auriculus refuses our help. Unless she's dead set on having her nation cease to exist, I don't think that'll happen. The final container was locked into its place in the berth. Leanne glanced over the side again. The waterline was just above the half-meter mark etched on the side of the barge. A clatter filled the air as the harbor staff rolled a metal shutter over the hold. Once it was locked shut, Leanne walked back towards the bridge. It's Niman time. And then, they nimmed. Well, not really. The barge was released from its moorings and slowly went on its way. Leanne silently willed the Death Knight to nim harder, but it didn't work. Clara, can your workers swim? Leanne turned her gaze to the deck at Florian's question. About 24 workers from the dry dock and the harbor were wandering about, checking the ship's components and watching the scenery slowly go by. All of them can at least swim to the harbor's edge just in case they fall off for some reason, Clara said. I haven't tossed them into the river to see if they can beat the current. Come to think of it, can you two swim? No. Nope. You should learn before we leave for the Draconic Kingdom. It's not hard. With our enchanted equipment, we could probably swim quite quickly. Wait a minute, Leanne peered at Clara. What about those scriptures of yours? I thought your tenets say that you shouldn't do what you shouldn't be doing. Clara tilted her head, tapping her chin in thought. You're right, she said with a sad sigh. I suppose you'll just have to drown. That's probably a joke, Leanne frowned. Probably, Clara smiled slightly. I don't know what comes to mind when you think of us, but our religion is practically seamless with everyday life. If it's something you have to do, then you have to do it. My life doesn't grind to a halt if my maids aren't around. I dunno, Leanne said. Ludmilla always says you're spoiled and lazy at home. We saw some of that while we stayed together in the Empire, too. Followers of the Six had some strange religious customs. No, to be more accurate, followers of the Six in Riestais, the majority of whom were now subjects of the Sorceress Kingdom, had some strange religious customs. They had tenets that prescribed what was proper for everyday life, which covered everything from vocational activities to household chores. On one hand, they were encouraged to pursue vocational excellence, to be the best whatever they were that they could be. To a point, this could be seen as what most people did. A blacksmith treated their craft seriously because their livelihoods depended on their work. If they got better at it, they could negotiate more lucrative contracts. At least this was how it worked in Lian's head. Rationally speaking, everyone should desire improvement. In practice, however, people got lazy or decided what they were doing was good enough. This usually happened when an artisan was recognized as master by their respective guilds. Adventurers in the old system hit gold rank or merchants secured comfortable profit margins and reliable business. Some vocations were dependent on factors that a person had no control over, such as the weather, availability of mineral veins or things to fight, so they just took life as it came and tried to get by. Followers of the Six, however, were never satisfied. They all constantly strove to better themselves in their respective vocations and even went out of their way to do so. If a grandmaster blacksmith was making iron nails, he'd try to make the most goddamned perfect iron nails in the history of ever. Clara and Ludmilla were no exception to this. Inheriting their titles and making sure things were running well wasn't enough. They had to deserve the fact that they were nobles, more than anyone else. This, of course, made every other noble in the Sorceress Kingdom scream because they set the bar so high that it was next to impossible to match them. While they could console themselves when it came to Clara and her superlative excellence, Ludmilla was another story because they were supposed to be better than her at certain things. Lian suspected that the Prime Minister would show up at the House of Lords one day with a chart. That chart would show how Warden's Vale achieved a 250,000% increase in productivity over the past year, and why couldn't everyone else do at least double that? On the opposite end of things, followers of the Six were instructed to do everything else in moderation. If possible, they were to avoid performing tasks that those in their vocation weren't supposed to be doing. A place for everything and everything in its place. According to her merchant companies that traded in the theocracy, the people there weren't very extreme about these practices. They did do it to a degree, but nothing that approached what went on in Corlin County. Lian could only surmise that the limited power of the temples in Riestais caused them to focus their attention on the people, whereas the temples in the theocracy were busy running the country. Practically speaking, the temples in the Sorceress Kingdom relied on their congregation for tithes and alms, so they were incentivized to encourage their tenets so they would have more productive people. The temples in the theocracy, on the other hand, probably received a huge portion of the nation's budget. Since their tenets would result in greater tax revenues, they broadly promoted their doctrines, but the focus wasn't so minute. The barge tilted slightly as it made a smooth turn before heading west up the other side of the harbor. Lian eyed the helmsman. "Can I try driving the boat?" she asked. "No," Florine said. "Hey," Lian protested, "I own a quarter of this boat." "And I own another quarter," Florine replied. Lian turned to Clara. "No," Clara said. "What?" "There you have it," Florine said, 2-1. 3, Clara corrected her, "I'm casting a vote for Ludmilla's share too." "This is tyranny," Lian wailed, "oppression by the masses. I hope we never use this system for anything big. It's arbitrary and irrational." She left the bridge, walking out onto the sunlit deck. The barge was already halfway to the other side of the harbor, which meant that it was going at about 10 kilometers an hour. Lian smiled to herself. It was already 3 times faster than a horse-drawn wagon. Assuming that it could successfully pass all of its tests on the river, it would be mere hundredths of a copper to the kilogram for transport between Corlin Harbor and the Draconic Kingdom, which was roughly 600 kilometers away. "Don't go too close to the side," Florine warned her from behind. "This ship is insanely heavy. If you fall off and it hits you, you might be seeing what resurrection feels like firsthand." We should add railings or something," Lian said. "We kept the deck nearly bare because we weren't sure how much weight it would take to sink it, but it's barely in the water after filling up. Could add some other things too." "Like what?" "Stuff that makes money. No matter how you look at it, nothing's as heavy as these containers. How about a ferry service? We can add a second level to this bridge and create accommodations. The sound of shoes tapping over the steel deck approached as Clara joined them. That sounds nice for the route between here and Warden's Vale, she said, but living things that try to ride a ship through the Katza Plains are just going to get murdered by wraiths and other things that can pass through the hull. Can't the temples do something about that? Sanctify the ship or something? The crew is undead, Florine frowned. Then how do we get our merchants from here to there? Past the bow of the barge, the western harbor locks came close. The elder leech's imp familiar flew out over the narrow space as the vessel slowly eased itself in. I was hoping that we could lease some buildings at a suitable harbor, Clara said. That way we'll have a branch office for our people to operate out of. They don't need to go back and forth through the Katza Plains, the undead can ship cargo to them and they'll work from there. That assumes they have any buildings left, Leanne muttered. I can't wait till Venomscale delivers those maps that we asked for. Warren Venomscale was a Wyvern Rider chief who had volunteered to conduct an aerial survey of the Draconic Kingdom with his tribe's best hunters. In return, he would receive a hefty sum of 500 platinum trade coins. They encouraged him to buy samples of goods from the Sorceress Kingdom with his earnings and bring them back to his people. Hopefully, that would generate more interest in trade. Though tribal governments were often disparaged as primitive and their people savage, the Wyvern Riders had a fairly complex society. They produced several goods that were not easily procured anywhere else, but convincing them to trade those goods involved convincing them that there was something worth trading for. They were an insular society that generally disposed of intruders. Not that they minded intruders, they were basically free food for their wyverns. Fortunately for Leanne and Florine, beauty and charisma could open doors that spears and arrows could not. Still, their isolationist state meant that they had little interest in simply accumulating trade coins. The lock finished draining and the front gate opened. They slipped out into the river beyond, turning into the current to head west around the base of Castle Corlin. Leanne thought that their ride had been suspiciously smooth so far, but she often had that feeling when it came to new technology. The precision that came with her new machining workshops resulted in goods that functioned with an unheard-of degree of reliability. She and her artisans were used to having at least a noticeable flaw or two in everything, so it just felt strange. "Do you really believe that it will be that bad?" Florine asked. "You'd think they'd at least send emissaries to ask for help if it was. The Holy Kingdom did just that this winter. They were invaded by demi-humans too, and they're at least as far away from us as we are from the Draconic Kingdom. We sort of have an undead-infested wasteland between us," Leanne answered. "Besides, the Sorceress Kingdom popped up after they were invaded by beastmen. They had no time to set up a diplomatic mission here, nor are they probably willing to risk sending diplomats to a country ruled by an undead sovereign. His Majesty is a great guy, but they don't know that." "But why didn't we do anything?" "The Sorceress Kingdom, I mean. That invasion started over 15 months ago and we've been trying to create a good image for the country." "Why indeed? Normal reasons wouldn't work. If a new country popped up, it would be focusing on stabilizing its reign and ensuring things were going well at home. But that didn't stop them from setting up diplomatic missions in the surrounding countries. Yet, the Sorceress Kingdom didn't do that. They didn't even have a diplomatic mission in the Empire, which was their client state. Distance was also no excuse. Lady Sheltier could be anywhere instantly as long as she had an idea of the destination. Martial strength was similarly not an issue. Dispatching a squad of Death Series servitors would probably turn things around in short order. This left them with two possibilities. The first was that the royal court simply didn't know or care. Out of sight, out of mind. There had been no merchants from the Draconic Kingdom since shortly after the invasion began, and there was no news of refugees fleeing across the sea to the slain theocracy. The second possibility was that the royal court had ignored the Draconic Kingdom's plight on purpose. To Leanne, this was the most likely explanation. Clara had been working on her river transportation network for roughly a year. It had transformed into a monumental rescue effort at the beginning of winter, and the royal court simply went along with it. Perhaps they had foreseen the development, or perhaps it was a test. Perhaps it was both. "They probably wanted an extra good image," Leanne said. Clara and Florine sighed. They were all well versed in statecraft, diplomacy, economics and trade, so they likely knew that it was an optimal course of action. But that didn't mean that they had to like it. In this matter, however, their hands were tied and they could only make the best out of what was allowed to them. The Draconic Kingdom wouldn't complain, at least not to their faces. This was especially the case if the alternative was obliteration by the invading beastmen. The barge completed its long turnaround castle call into its southern side, entering the wide expanse of the Katza River. Ahead of them, an elder lich floated with a red flag held up in one hand. The vessel slowed to a stop in front of it, holding its position using the stream of water deflected from the nozzles in the rear. Leanne went back into the bridge, standing at the window beside the helmsman. Roughly 100 meters behind the elder lich in front of them was another elder lich. More of them appeared at 100-meter intervals in a straight line out from them. "How fast do you think we'll them?" Leanne asked. "Where did you even pick that word up?" Florine gave her a look. Some kids watching the wagons on the test track," Leanne said. "Isn't." The elder lich in the front changed his red flag for a green one. "Full speed ahead," the captain said. Beside Leanne, the Death Knight reached out to set the gear indicator to 1 and the power dial to its highest position. Rather than lurch forward, the ship slowly accelerated as it had the other times it started moving. The gear indicator was shifted to 2 after several seconds, then 3 a dozen seconds after that. Out to the sides, visible waves started to ripple out from the bow of the ship. "Maybe I should have added more gears," Leanne said. "I don't think it would have mattered too much," Clara replied. "The test results from the frost giants indicate that how fast a ship can move through the water is dependent on the length of its hull. What if Lady Sheltier is pushing it from behind? Well, it might go faster if we do that, but, with our propulsion, there's something that makes it harder and harder to accelerate when you approach a certain speed relative to the length of the ship." A shadow crossed over them as they passed under the bridge over the river. No one watched from overhead. It seemed that the only witnesses to this bit of history were themselves, the workers on the ship and the undead. Once it seemed like they weren't getting any faster, Leanne counted out the seconds between one elder lich to the next. About 18 seconds between elder liches," she said. 20 kilometers per hour. The month-and-a-half-long journey to the Draconic Kingdom by wagon reduced to a day and a half by river. Florine crossed her arms. "This has to be cheating. And only our undead-operated ships can make the trip," Leanne grinned. "It's super cheating. This is gonna be ridiculous."